I need to explain a little bit about what I do. I'm basically a photographer. And as a photographer, I'm interested in the Chinese communities in Southeast Asia. But tonight, I'm not going to talk too much about my work as a photographer. I'm going to talk about my work as an arts researcher. Since I think 2004, I've been writing about photography, and then I think since 2006, I've been focusing about photography, contemporary photography in Southeast Asia. And that's what I'm going to talk about. And I'm not just interested in photography as a kind of art or, as a form of expression. I'm also interested in photography in terms of the vernacular usage, culture, politics, and issue of representation. And tonight, I'm going to give you a sort of overview of what has happened in Southeast Asia since 1980s. And first, I need to define what I mean by documentary. Just bear with me. I need to get the research question clear first. The mechanical function of a camera is documentary because the minute you press the trigger, it is an image of what is happening right in front of you. So actually, the mechanical function of a camera is documentary in essence. But that doesn't really help us understand what is documentary photography. My research area, right, I'm more interested in independent, non-commissioned works of photography that's of documentary nature. But this is not a hard and fast rule because sometimes commission work can come from actually things that you are interested in on a personal level. So what I mean is that a photographer might be doing a project about refugees and then later be commissioned by an NGO to follow up that work. So that's how something personal something that you do on your own can become then a commission work. And of course, personal work can also then be sold to agencies. So the boundary is not so clear. Generally, I'm not interested in press or wire photography. I'm more interested in long-term, issue-based, phenomenon-based photography, looking at a social issue, social phenomenon. It can be totally personal, looking at what is happening to the photographer's personal life. It can also be something that is, something what we call street photography. I also, in my research, I also tend to research about photographers working in their home environment. So I'm more interested in a Cambodian photographer doing a project in Cambodia rather than a Singaporean photographer going to Cambodia to do a project. Okay, and so let me give you a brief kind of opening here. There are three external events based on how I look at it that had significant impact on documentary photography in Southeast Asia. First is 1986, Fall of Marcos in the Philippines. And Philippines has at least 100, by then, 1986, Philippines had already close to 60 or 70 years of so-called Philippine indigenous photography. And what happened in 1986 was essentially the lifting of control, and then what used to be a very energetic documentary environment started blooming again. So that's the first event that happened. Then 1997, 1998, as we all know, Asian financial crisis. And in Thailand, they call the Tom Yang Kong, 1997. And then 1998, the fall of Suharto. And then the fall of Suharto has a big bearing on documentary press and journalism in Indonesia and Malaysia. And that generation of photographers are very important. The other event that happened, which I thought was quite interesting, is 2004 Asian tsunami. It is actually coincidental that 2004 is also, based on my experience of it, is the time where digital photography became good enough, cheap enough, and accessible enough for people to actually pick it up. So it's a technological shift. At the same time, it is also something that happened, a disaster that happened, and then it created an opportunity for regional photographers to do their own editorial assignments. So this is the three main shifts, and I'm going to take you through some of the important people here. So this is a brief survey. It is not exhaustive, but I'm very interested in photographers who have a clear vision of what they do, and they can articulate their vision. And so basically, these are the photographers that I've picked to talk about. They are people that are working, usually not bounded or not influenced by trends or style, and they have what I call a program or a vision of what they want to achieve in their work. I'm going to first start with three Filipino photographers. Alex Baluyut, he did this project actually in 1981, but only published this work in 1986. He is one of those people that was like underground, anti-Marcos, and at that time he was working for AP. And then after 3 years, there was a contact call from Mindanao, and he went down south to photograph the New People's Army. The New People's Army is the Philippine communists, and at that time they were considered as underground and anti-Marcos, and it was extremely dangerous for him to go and photograph this body of work. When he finally published the work in 1986 and 87, this body of work became like the first photo book to win the National Book Prize in the Philippines. And his style is quite straightforward, direct, and brutal, and very in your face and in the conflict zone. And there's two areas where the MPA, the New People's Army, was active at that time. In the north, Luzon, and in Mindanao. And the Mindanao area was much more dangerous. And in Philippines today, right, the younger Philippine photojournalists consider Alex as someone who represents the kind of like fearless, the profile of fearless journalist, and he believes that photography can effect change. Okay, and then I have to talk about Sony Yabao. Sony Yabao is, we often in Philippines there's an ongoing joke. We say Alex Baluyut and Sony Yabao is the yin and yang of Philippine photojournalism. Sony Yabao is much older, actually. Sony Yabao is at least, I think, 10 or 20 years older than Alex. And Alex would, at every occasion that he has, he would attack Sony Yabao because Sony Yabao was involved with the Marcos regime. What happened was that he was working for the government. But you have to understand the situation then. Everybody more or less had to work for the government if you want to survive. And he did a few assignments for the government, and since then Alex has always been talking about him as a worm. He calls him a worm. Since the late 90s, he has been trying to do something, what he calls magic realism in photography, which is where different elements come together and create something that's quite curious in the image. And I think this image is quite illustrative of what he's trying to do. And then we have Tommy Hafala. Tommy Hafala is a photographer that started in 1978, and then he went to the mountains and stayed in the Grand Cordillera in northern Luzon, which is where the minorities are, and he has been there since the last 30 years. So he has been accepted into the community. He's one of those photographers that became interested in the minority culture, and then decided that instead of doing aviation, because he was trained in aviation, he decided to give that up and just go to the mountain and be with the minorities. And now he's accepted into the community, and whenever there's like a village meeting, he has a role to play. So he's like part of the community. I think his example is quite important because I often see young photographers going to the mountains and doing a project for 1 month and coming back with a lot of beautiful images that are totally out of context, wrongly captioned, and without a clear understanding of what's happening. This is someone who has like given up 30 years of his life to be there. So to close up this starting three photographers, right? You can see that these three people, right, what they are doing and what their obsessions are still relevant today in the Philippines. I will give you the three things. In today's Philippine photojournalism, you will still see an obsession with, number one, Mindanao. Young photographers in Philippines are still obsessed with Mindanao as an area, as a topic. They're interested in the minorities, and they're also interested in the idea of the activist photographer. I'm not saying every photographer now in Philippines have these three features, but if you look at all the across Philippine photographers, especially photojournalists and documentary photographers, right, you will see that they will be interested in one or two of these. But the younger photographers, I feel also with the internet, right, they now realize that the market is not just the Philippines. And that is quite a big shift. And I can feel that like a lot of them are now more interested in what they can do by presenting their work overseas. And what I call the James Natchery style of photography, that means you fly into a war zone and then take some photographs and go home and become a war photographer. So you can see that there's a slight shift in what they are doing now. I'm going to just leave it as that. And maybe that's why coming to KL in Malaysia, maybe that's why people often think Eric Paris is not a sexy enough photographer. But he's one of like the early photojournalists in Malaysia, working essentially for the press. But he's someone that is a photographer born into a painter family. His father is a painter, his mother is an artist. And so I think in many ways he wants to be an artist. And he has done like close to 30 shows in his life. I think he does one show a year. And when you look at his shows, right, his shows are never about actually, his show is never really about journalism, but he's doing all sorts of things, experimenting with the medium, you know, trying to push the language. And he enjoys traveling the country. That's what he always tells me. And this series is a very simple series where you can see that he's trying to capture the way people lean on traffic lamps. But sadly, in Malaysia, a lot of the younger documentary photographers don't think too highly of him. Eric Prasetya is definitely one of like Southeast Asia's most important documentary photographers, without a doubt. He just brought out his first book after 20 years shooting Jakarta. He just managed to publish his first book, and this guy has never done a single solo show in his life. But he has this big body of work about Jakarta that is quite stunning. He started out as a fixer for Salgado, but in the end he ended up fighting with Salgado. Same as Alex Baluyut, by the way. Alex Baluyut was also the fixer of Salgado and then ended up fighting with Salgado. And for Eric, that became a turning point. He then realized that what Salgado is doing, he can't do that. Because he brought Salgado to a slum called Ciliwung, Ciliching, I think. Ciliching in Jakarta. And when Salgado saw the slum, Salgado said, wow, this is 10 times better than anything I've seen in Mumbai. And then Eric realized that, you know, he can't be a photographer like Salgado. And he can't be obsessed with all this, you know, poverty, and he feels totally uncomfortable about it. And then he started thinking like, why shouldn't photographers who are normally middle class, why shouldn't photographers photograph the middle class? He then started working like in small sub-series. So he has a series about the trains, he has a series about the nightclubs, he has a series about shopping malls, he has a series about the Reformasi movement. He is not born in Jakarta. He's someone that's born in Padang, in Sumatra, and then migrated to Jakarta. So this is in a way like his personal diary of his life in Jakarta. But at the same time, his life is so intertwined with Jakarta's history. He has been involved in the anti-Suharto movement since 1980s. So when he was studying in Institute Technology of Bandung in West Java, he was already in the underground movement to overthrow Suharto. He was one of the youngest student leaders at that time. And then he was also the only photographer that managed to smuggle a camera into the jail when Suharto was still around to take photographs of the jail. So when Reformasi happened, right, he was out on the street, but he was not doing assignments. Actually, he was out on the street to see what he has been fighting for the last 20 years come to fruition right in front of him. So it's also in a way it's a kind of personal memoir for him. So this work is not only documentary, and he's the only photographer that has a very serious program of a serious vision of like documenting a city. Oscar Motuloh is someone of Eric's generation, the photo editor of Antara, which is the national news agency of Indonesia. He's essentially a press photographer, but again, when he does his personal work, right, he's more interested in the arts actually than to do press work. What I'm showing is actually just like the images that he took at that time during Reformasi, just to show you what he has done. This image is iconic. A lot of people use this image. He's more known nowadays as an educator, a curator, but he was quite important during 1997-98 when he did like 3 bodies of work that was not directly documentary but was trying to talk about the Reformasi using metaphors. So it's Carnival, it's Sound of Angkor, and The Art of Dying. All 3 have catalogs, but I only have one copy of it. Mani, of course, everybody, a lot of people are quite familiar with him. He's synonymous with the Pinkman series, but some people don't realize that he did a big body of work about Bangkok in the so-called language of street photography. It's also published in a book. Mani is a very political person, and actually, in a way, this body of work tells you what he is obsessed in terms of politics and in terms of what is happening in Thailand and Bangkok. What he's more interested in is something that's more spontaneous, but something that pushes the artist to the point of being crazy in that Thai environment. To me, it's like a sketch. It's like a sketch of what he would eventually do in the next 10 years. Rama Surya, quite important in Indonesia because he's actually a disciple of Eric Prasetya and essentially a documentary and street photographer. He published in 1996, before the fall of Suharto, he published a book called Yang Kuat Yang Kalah, which then became like the Bible for independent documentary press photographers in Indonesia. He became sort of the role model of subsequent photographers like people would know, like Kamal Jufri, Muhammad Iqbal. This is a different set of work. When he moved to, as you can see, this is when he moved to Yogyakarta later, after the fall of Suharto. And then he started like wandering on the streets and trying to capture the mythology of Yogyakarta in the post-Suharto era. Yogyakarta is a place where the Javanese are very interested and have a strong reverence for. It's a place where the old cultures mix with the contemporary cultures. The Hinduism, the Buddhism mixing with shopping mall culture, Hindu rock culture. And he's trying to capture a little bit of that. But this body of work has never been published or has never been shown in Indonesia as well. A little bit of my work actually is trying to salvage a lot of these projects that has never been really seen. Heng Sinip is the first generation Cambodian photojournalist after the fall of Pol Pot and the withdrawal of the Vietnamese troops in the early 90s. And he started out by taking tourist photographs in front of the National Palace in around 1993. Then he had a chance to study a little bit about photojournalism, and then he soon started working for the press. Now he's working for AP in Cambodia. There's one photographer working for AP. Actually, the 4 agencies, right? There's one photographer working for each one of them. He's working for AP. He's generally considered the oldest of that generation. In about, I think this is 1999 or 2000, he had the opportunity to do a project about the Khmer Rouge, working with the DC Camp, Documentation Center of Cambodia. As people who have visited Phnom Penh know, that the S21 prison, they had preserved a lot of photographs of the victims of the Khmer Rouge regime. But at the same time, actually, the Khmer Rouge also took pictures of the young comrades. So actually, the Khmer Rouge comrades were also photographed. And what he did was actually he took the photographs of the comrades and then relocated all these junior comrades. These are not the high-ranking people, because the high-ranking people are all in the government now. The high-ranking people are not really being prosecuted, except 1 or 2. I mean, the prosecution process that's happening now, prosecutes a few of them, but a lot of the high-ranking people have not been prosecuted. These are essentially the junior Khmer Rouge people. And then he located these people, and then, not surprisingly, a lot of these people were like located in very, very far away villages now, and they live in sort of like a fear. But you must understand that when they were recruited for the KR, right, Khmer Rouge, they are probably about 12, 13 or 14. So essentially they are just kids when they were recruited to participate in the killing. I mean, the work is very important for me because I think it offers a different way of understanding Khmer Rouge culture, which is at the same time supported by historians working on the same topic, who are essentially arguing that a lot of the junior Khmer Rouge members are actually also victims because they were forced to do the killing. they recruited at 12, 13, and then brainwashed to carry out the program that Pol Pot has planned for. I've got to talk about Kachin not because he's here, but because he's important. Yeah. And he's important within the context of Singapore because I think there are very few documentary photographers in Singapore with a sustained interest of Singapore as a subject matter. Kachin has over the years, especially since Panoramic Singapore, done a series of work that relates to our country. And I mean, of course, he won the Hasselblad Master, but I always feel that, you know, the body of work that he leaves behind eventually is going to be quite important for us. I remember Kachin told me that when he was doing this body of work, right, he was in a way trying to show that, to prove to other photographers that there are interesting projects to be done in Singapore. And I think that's quite a valid point to make, because I think even for me, the tendency is always to go to a different country to shoot. Chitech actually is, Chitech doesn't really sell himself as a documentary photographer, but essentially his work is also documentary in nature. He started actually more or less at the same time as Kachin. His first body of work was in 2000. This is where the Post Museum is now, and before the Post Museum was converted, they decided to go in quickly to photograph the walls of the brothels. So this is the place where the South Asian workers come for, you know, sex, and is generally known to be a very cheap area to do so. And what he did was just basically take a 6x6 camera and record the walls, and the details actually have a lot of it allows you to think of like the connections of the space, and his interest in, he has always been interested in discarded space, and it has something to do with his education, because when he started out, he wasn't a student. I mean, he was not very good in languages. So in Singapore, if you're not good in languages, you don't do well. You generally don't do so well in school. And he ended up in an art school, and then he had like a distinct feeling of being like discarded by the Singapore education system. So a lot of his work has to do with that throwaway, you know, the sense of being abandoned and thrown away and discarded. That's essentially his artistic vision across the year. The next person we are talking about is Muhammad Iqbal. He started out, you know, working like any documentary photographer, going to his subject, staying with the subject, and then using a 35mm camera, trying to get as close as possible. And then, he did a long project about the transfer sites, the transexuals in Jakarta, about 5 years. Then he became very uncomfortable with the relation that he has with his subject. And he feels that this relationship, this 35mm getting close to your subject, this relationship is something that he cannot reconcile. So when the tsunami happened, he decided to work very slowly using a 6x6 camera. He decided to go after everybody has left and then start taking portraits of the survivors and talking to them, you know, asking them, you know, to pose a little bit and trying to understand what is the suffering, what was the suffering that they had experienced. So it's quite a big departure from what the press were putting out in Indonesia. He's often he's often seen to be like the antithesis of Kamal Jufri, because Kamal Jufri is very press and agency based. I think, you know, in some ways I agree with what he's trying to do, because I think always, you know, the relationship between the photographer and the subject is something that is quite crucial. And I think a good photographer always think about that relationship between the space, that relationship and the distance between the photographer and the subject. And he always thinks about that. That's why his work eventually changed to a different direction. Azril is again not trained as a press photographer. He studied art photography in the US, and then was assisting in US for a few years, doing commercial work. And then after 9/11, America refused to extend his green card, and he came back to Malaysia and then became a gun for hire. And what that means in Malaysia means that you shoot a photograph for the newspaper and get paid for 5 ringgit or 20 ringgit, depending on the size of your photograph. And then he was like quite frustrated, and then he decided to do a project about the Pudu jail, which is in KL. But what he did was, instead of just photographing the exterior, he decided to photograph the graffiti of the wall. And using long exposure, it was for him a way to get away from commercial work. So he would go there and then he would do long exposure on the walls. And then sometimes he would stay overnight at the prison. At that point of time, the prison was empty. Because there were a few periods of its history when the government was about to just demolish it. And then they cleared everybody. And then later to go back on the decision and then move everybody back again. So this is one of the periods where the jail was empty. And then he made photographs of the walls, the graffiti. You know, when you look at the prison walls, it tells you that race politics in Malaysia is really out of context. Because you can see, like, on the walls itself, you have Burmese writings, you have Tamil, you have, of course, Mandarin and English. And race is not a big issue in that environment. Vandi Ratana, he should be considered like the first Cambodian photographer after the Heng Sinis generation, who has a quite specific vision of what he wants to do in his photography. And this is actually his first work, shot in 2005 and 2006, which was then exhibited in Noorderlicht and in Holland, which is essentially looking at what his family is and what his office looks like. He has this continuous obsession of what, I would call it an anthropological obsession of what is Cambodian, what makes Cambodian Cambodian. And you must understand that during the Pol Pot regime, right, a lot of photographs of old Cambodia was destroyed. So today we have like quite a big gap in terms of like photographic collection. A lot of the older photographs cannot really be found. I mean, we have scattered resources now, and there's now a center in Phnom Penh which is called Bopana, and they work with collectors around the world and archives around the world, and slowly they are starting to build the archives. But a lot of, especially the family snapshots, are lost. And what he tries to do in his work is actually to travel the country and to see Cambodia and try to record Cambodia. There are a lot of photographers going to Cambodia, and they go away from Cambodia with photographs of ladyboys, beggars, and monks, and then maybe Angkor Wat. He and his friends have this program where they feel that, you know, this is not Cambodia. He's one of the most well-exposed photographers actually from Cambodia. He has shown in like a lot of places. And it's very interesting because essentially he's doing documentary work. But he's showing in all the art venues actually. He has been to APT, Asia Pacific Trienna. He was showing in Chancery Gallery in Hong Kong, and they showed a body of work which is about a fire. And that body of work was sold, collected by collectors. Vietnam has a long history of photojournalism, and if you read Tim Page's book about Vietnamese photographers during the Vietnam War, you will get a very, very clear sense of what happened. And but after that, we know very little. After 1975, we know very little. We know a lot about, we know relatively a lot about North Vietnam because they are considered to be the winners. So we know relatively more about North Vietnam documentary or photojournalists, but we know less of the South Vietnamese documentary photographers because most of them were sent to re-education camps or after reunification in 1975, or they just left the country altogether. Lam is a very, very young photographer. He's like, I think, slightly, 35 maybe, considered quite young. And again, not working with, he's not a journalist, he's not working for the papers, he's just interested in photography. He studied photography in school, and he was quite lucky to come under the tutelage of Wee Sun Hui. Wee Sun Hui was like Wee Sun Hui was the first Vietnamese photographer in the post-Doi Moi era to go to America to study photography. And then he managed to come back to Saigon and then teach for, I think, 2 semesters before he really couldn't find, before he realized that he really cannot make any money from teaching. And at that point in time, he even had to like buy film for his students. And Lam was one of his students. And then like he went on to make this body of work, which is like the apartments, using a very slow camera, a medium format camera, and wandering in the corridors. looking at the lives. These apartments, as we are speaking now, these apartments are being torn down. So this will become part of South Vietnamese history. They are building like, I've been to the new buildings. They're building like flats, something like what we see in Singapore. They're building like new flats. So it's not just. I told Lam, because I went with Lam to one of these places, and I told him that, when you tear down this building, right, it's not just the building that you lose. You lose a way of life, because you can see that everything happens in the corridor. They have weddings in the corridor. They sell beer. They sell fur. But once it goes to a flat kind of environment, everybody closes the door. So I think with this I will end the presentation, and shall we have a Q&A? It's not highly regarded by independent documentary photographers in Malaysia. I think I get a sense, but I cannot say for sure. He's more well regarded in the art community actually, and he's quite popular amongst local collectors in Malaysia. But if you speak to a younger documentary photographer from KL, right, they usually won't mention Eric Paris. I think that they feel that his work is passé. He's looking at Malaysia, which is not a sexy topic. He's looking at people leaning against the traffic lights. He had 3 books. His first book is Tin Mine Landscape, which is sold out. You can find, but we have a copy in the National Library. And his second book is based. He's more like an artist. Actually, when he publishes a book, usually it's about his art photography. It's not really about press. And I think he has a book of landscape, based on Tagore's poems. And you can see why actually the younger documentary photographers would think that, this guy is interpreting poems using photography. So maybe that's why they feel like it's like maybe not that sexy. But I feel that he's quite important. I have to say he's quite important in Malaysia. When I look at how a museum collects, right, I shouldn't mention the museum, but sometimes it's quite haphazard. It's like when I look at Vandi's work. I'm very close to Vandi. I think he's producing great work. It's important work, but you would not think that a journalistic piece would be sold in a commercial gallery. You see, he has more artistic work or more independent projects, but sometimes it's a matter of a gallery believing in you and then a collector buying, and that's it. It's just a simple transaction. But the thing is, everybody is trying to look for the next great thing, the next big thing, the next big hole to be discovered. So it's going to be Southeast Asia. Okay. It's a matter of speculation. But it's not. I'm not saying that all this kind of comment is useless. Actually, I'm just saying that when a lot of people talk about you, it does affect your price in the auction. But because I'm an arts writer, so I've got to put this pitch here that I think, if I'm a Singaporean photographer, I must be written by a Singaporean writer. I need to be written and to be reviewed by a Singaporean art critic or Singaporean writer. What I'm trying to say is that art writers are very, very important, because these are the people that understand the work from an insider's perspective. It's easier to talk about the impact of these photographers, especially when they're a little bit older. Okay, so that's why I started with the 3 Filipino photographers. As I've explained already, if you look at what they're interested in terms of themes and concerns and issues, right, you can still see almost the same obsession amongst younger Philippine photographers in that kind of themes. For instance, they are interested in Mindanao. They are interested in using photography as an agent of change, and they're also interested in the minorities. So you can see that. And then you have photographers who gravitate towards Yabao, who like his more street, random kind of work. And then there are photographers who would go closer to Alex, who believes in like very hardcore, straight up photojournalism. And then people who would admire Tommy Hafala, who gave up like his youth to be with the minorities. Oscar Motuloh in Indonesia. He is like a rallying point for young documentary wannabes, I always say. And people go to him for advice. You know, he works as a curator. He writes frequently in Bahasa about photography in Indonesia. And I have a lot of his collection of essays. And he's an educator, but he himself is also a photographer. I think first, why I'm interested in photographers working in their own environment, that is because that's my research question. I have to have a research question at the start. I cannot do all sorts of things at the same time. So I'm interested primarily in photographers working in their own environment, because I feel that they have an insider perspective to it. I think it takes a lot of resilience, a lot of patience to work in your own environment. I think in a way it is easier to travel. If you ask me honestly speaking, I don't think there is exactly a trend. But I'm just saying that, yes, it's easier to travel, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the work is better. I mean, you can produce a short body of work and then be shown in festivals around the world, but that doesn't necessarily mean a lot of things in terms of how I look at photography. Because I always see that photography is potentially a rootless kind of medium, because there's no way you can hold down photography as a medium by itself. You need words, you need context, you need introductions, you need people talking. That's why we are talking. You know, we need people to talk about photography. Photography by itself cannot do a lot of things. That's my basic assumption. I know a lot of photographers will not agree, but I'm quite certain that photography by itself cannot do a lot of things. And we need to talk, we need to explain. That's why we have platforms, in a way, actually. I always look at that that contextualization process of that body of work and the environment. That is quite important for me. And so this photographer might be very famous, but I don't always then think that his work is better. I think Eric's work, for instance, is better for me, but he's hardly known outside of Indonesia. He has a clear vision of what he was trying to do, and he maintained that vision for 20 years. And I know it's quite lonely to maintain that vision for 20 years, because there's a lot of times where it is always easier to give up. But he did. And he just slowly accumulated his work. Nobody gave him like $5 million to do a project about Jakarta, actually. And he's just like waiting for someone to fund the project, to do the book. But he has already that body of work for the last, I think, in fact, he already had that body of work since 2004. And the work was in a mock. And this is an archive of 15 years of Jakarta that nobody in Indonesia has. But until now, it's finally published. So I'm quite happy for him.